Hi, I'm MF Thomas, and this is My Dark Path.
To anyone with an appetite for history, the city of Prague is a feast for the eyes. Everywhere I've been in the capital of this modern-day Czech Republic, there are visible reminders of stories that stretch back over 1,000 years. Prague Castle, the largest ancient castle in the world, saw construction start in the 9th century. Within its walls, the masterpiece of Gothic architecture known as St. Vitus Cathedral had its foundation stone laid by King John of Bohemia in 1344. And it wasn't officially completed until 1929, almost 600 years later. Compared with the other major cities of Europe, Prague's historic architecture survived World War II mostly unscathed. And along its streets, you can see influences from the Baroque period all the way back to the Holy Roman Empire.
But when I looked east from the castle, along the Vltava River, I saw something astonishing even amid the boundless variety of Prague. A massive oval structure, over 130 feet long, rested on a sleek, modern building of glass and concrete. At a distance, the shape appeared to be so precariously positioned, so wrong and so unusual that my immediate thought was that something had crash-landed onto the building. But I was fairly certain if that had happened to this building in Prague, I would have heard about it. But nevertheless, this combination of the known and unknown intrigued me.
So I started walking, and after an hour I arrived at this unusual building. Its mysterious rooftop structure is called the Gulliver Airship. It's not a real airship, but an auditorium with seating for 100, accessible via the roof of the Dock's Contemporary Arts Center. The center's director described the airship as, quote, a dream of 12-year-old boys. The museum hoped the shape might evoke some of the wonder and optimism of the heyday of airships in the early 20th century.
I paid my fee and went inside and wandered through the galleries of modern art, but the real attraction for me was an exhibit of photos about airships.
One black and white picture especially stood out to me, an image of a giant cylinder hovering over Zurich, Switzerland. The photo presented a strange contrast, this otherworldly technology looming over an ancient city. It reminded me of the purported photos of alien craft swarming around Roswell, New Mexico. But this airship was real, glistening in broad daylight over the city in 1911.
What did it feel like to see a sight like that at the dawn of the 20th century? The world is full of mysteries where our knowledge just barely illuminates a problem, if at all. To see an airship in the early 1900s was to see the dawn of a new age of technology, but the experience might also have changed how one saw the world and its future. So standing in this exhibit and pondering this photo, I wondered, how do people react to disruptions? How do they respond to the unknown? Does it create wonder or terror, and why?
When we think of airships, we usually think of two things. Either we picture the Goodyear blimp hovering over a sporting event, or we think of the catastrophic explosion of the Hindenburg in 1937.
So when I saw the Gulliver airship, this audacious attempt to reclaim some of the old spirit of this invention, I was hooked. Suddenly, I had to know more of the story, not just about the invention of the technology, but how its triumphs and disasters illuminated the human condition. Hi, I'm MF Thomas, and this is My Dark Path. In every episode, we explore the fringes of history, science, and the paranormal. So if you geek out over these subjects, you're among friends here at My Dark Path. And be sure to like, comment, and share this video. And I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Finally, thanks for watching and choosing to walk the dark paths of the world with me. Let's get started with episode 1, Zeppelin and the Airship.
Part 1. By the time humanity was ready to fly, we had already been dreaming about it for centuries. Ancient Greeks told the tale of Icarus and the wings of feathers and wax made by his father Daedalus.
In the 3rd century BC, Alexander the Great reported seeing a flying craft shaped like a silver shield. Thousands of his soldiers reported the same strange vision. It's one of the first documented UFO sightings. In the 3rd century AD, there are records of the Chinese experimenting with hot air lanterns to send signals in the sky.
Over 1,000 years later, Leonardo da Vinci sketched ideas for flying machines that used the same principles as modern helicopters. Thoughtfully, as he was doing this, he also sketched a prototype for a parachute.
But it wasn't until 1783 that a series of technological advances first took people into the skies. And it wasn't the Chinese or the Greeks or an Italian genius of the Renaissance that got us there.
It was 2 French brothers, one an inventor and one a businessman. We're not talking about airships yet, but just as different species in the animal kingdom evolve from a common ancestor and then diversify, these first inventions are the ancestors of the airship, but branched off in different directions as they became more specialized. What the Montgolfier brothers, Joseph Michael and Jacques Etienne invented was the hot air balloon.
Their theory was that burning smoke contained a special gas that had the power to generate lift, if it could only be harnessed.
In 1782, they attached a small box to a primitive cloth envelope or crown, and when it caught the rising smoke, it lifted off the ground. The brothers were astounded seeing their experiments succeed, at least until seconds later when their balloon collided with the roof of their workshop.
Now, their underlying science was wrong. There is no magic special gas contained in burning smoke, but they had stumbled onto a true principle which made everything that came after possible, that hot air creates buoyancy. And for the first time in history, the idea of humans taking to the sky wasn't a myth or a dream sketched in a genius's notebook. It was a scientifically proven concept.
It only took a year for the Montgolfier brothers to advance their invention so far that they could test it with living passengers. In September of 1783, a hot air balloon containing a sheep, a duck, and a rooster rose up 1,500 feet in the air and flew across the skies of France for 8 minutes before landing 2 miles away. Later, it's reported they even sent up a giraffe. And just 1 month later, on the 19th of October, the Montgolfier brothers put 3 men, Jean-François, Jean-Baptiste, and Gerard de Villette, in the air. Their balloon was on a tether for safety, but it rose, it floated, and it flew. Humanity was in the sky. The following month, the tether was removed, and on November the 21st, François Laurent joined Desrosiers, and the 2 successfully completed the first free flight of any human beings in recorded history.
The Montgolfier brothers' invention was a sensation, and copycats soon followed. The revolutionary potential of hot air balloons captivated the French, and while it was a popular pastime for the wealthy, there were clear limitations. The baskets couldn't carry much weight, the balloons were fragile, and once you went up, you didn't have any control over where you went or where you came down.
In 1785, French inventor Jean-Pierre Blanchard took the first evolutionary step toward giving humanity control in the air. He combined a hydrogen-powered balloon with a hand-powered propeller. Now, with a lot of exhausting effort and a favorable wind, a balloon passenger could exercise a little control over their flight. To really put his invention to the test, Blanchard flew this rickety contraption all the way across the English Channel.
This is the first branch in the development of flight which led to the airship, that desire for control. But manual propellers were severely limited in power. Not to mention, the people of France soon had something else occupying their time, the French Revolution, and soon after, the Napoleonic Wars. If the balloon was inspiring to the imagination of the public, on the battlefield, it immediately expanded an army's power. Remember, this is a time without satellites, without airplanes, without even radios. The power to send scouts into the air to observe enemy armies over miles of land upended centuries of military strategy.
The French used military balloons in engagements like the Battle of Fleurus in 1794 and the Siege of Menez in 1795. A French painter named Jean-Baptiste Munez commemorated the Battle of Fleurus, and in the background of his painting, a dark balloon looms over the battlefield on the French side. The painting, depicting the moment that warfare took to the sky, hangs today in the Gallery of Battles at the Palace of Versailles.
Before there was such a thing as science fiction, there were authors that dabbled in what was called speculative fiction, the telling of stories that extrapolated wild scenarios from new technologies and current events.
Multiple stories at this time imagined the terrifying sight of a French army under Napoleon's power invading Britain, leading a fleet of hot air balloons.
But balloons still faced the same problems Blanchard had in crossing the English Channel. You couldn't carry much, you had almost no power, and if the weather didn't cooperate, you could end up dead. In order for flying to progress, science had to make a few leaps. There's an incident in 1808 that, I think, perfectly captures both the grip that balloons had on the popular imagination and their hazardous limitations.
It's the story of what was likely the first ever duel fought in hot air balloons. Two gentlemen, the story goes, were competing for the affections of a young dancer from the Paris Opera, and they decided to settle their dispute in the skies. Each, carrying a blunderbuss and accompanied by a second, ascended in balloons. The first one fired and missed. The other gentleman decided not to aim at his rival. Instead, he aimed at the rival's balloon. His shot punctured it, and his rival, along with the rival's poor second, plummeted to their deaths. History doesn't record what the young dancer thought of all of this.
It was a half a century before the next breakthrough that made airships possible. We're still in France, only now we're with a 27-year-old engineer named Henry Giffard.
It's 1852, and Giffard has built an envelope measuring 300 cubic meters, enormous for the time, and filled it with hydrogen gas. Only he's added something new to the equation, a steam engine. Finally, we have more than just human muscle in the air. With the steam engine working, Giffard can fly his invention at a top speed of 6 miles per hour. He gives it a simple name, the French word meaning directible. He calls it dirigible.
While the dirigible is a radical advance on the simple balloon, it too has only so many uses. Steam would not be enough. For the power it needed to evolve again, we need to leave France and go next door to Germany.
Today, most of the world's cars are powered by the same technology, the internal combustion engine. Its basic design dates all the way back to the revolutionary four-stroke engine created by German inventors Nicholas Otto and Eugen Langdon in 1876.
Remarkably, Nicholas Otto didn't even think it was useful for transportation. He disagreed about it so vehemently with his factory manager that the manager quit to found his own company. That manager was named Gottlieb Daimler, and the company he founded still exists today as Daimler AG, makers of Mercedes-Benz, and the world's oldest automobile company.
But back to the internal combustion engine, which was lighter, more efficient, and much more powerful than a steam engine.
It was inevitable someone would see what these new engines could do to power humanity through the skies.
And in 1898, the Brazilian inventor Alberto Santos Dumont constructed the world's first true gasoline-powered airship. At the time he was doing this, the Wright brothers in America were still developing kites.
And before they could create their pioneering airplane and fly it at Kitty Hawk, the airship took a dramatic leap forward in size, in power, and in global fame, all thanks to a man who'd been dreaming of them and working on them for decades.
It's time to meet the one and only Count Ferdinand Adolf Heinrich August Graf von Zeppelin. Part 2.
There's a reason why Zeppelin's name became literally synonymous with airships, so let's dig into his story.
Ferdinand von Zeppelin was born July 8th of 1838 in the Kingdom of Württemberg, on today's maps an area in southern Germany near the border with Switzerland. He attended a military academy near Stuttgart, becoming an officer in the Army of Württemberg in 1858. Then he took leave from the military to study science and engineering at a nearby university. It's this combination of a soldier's eye and a scientist's schooling that makes von Zeppelin the ideal candidate to help the airship continue its evolution. The question is, when did he get his first inspiration, and when did he have his first flight?
As is common for famous historical figures, many people want to claim their city, street, or building as the source of inspiration for that person's world-changing work. This is true of Zeppelin as well, as many would love to claim to be the location of his first balloon ride.
For example, in the state of Virginia in the United States, the Newport News Daily Press on May 30th of 1965 reported on the construction of an airport runway, which they claimed was being built over the site of von Zeppelin's first balloon ride. He was in America, the article says, in 1862, studying modern battlefield tactics up close during the Civil War. But let's explore this a little further. We do know that von Zeppelin visited America during the Civil War, and we also know that balloons were in use. From 1861 to 1863, the Union Army had an official balloon corps, using balloons as observation platforms, much the way Napoleon had. An old coal barge was converted into a Union naval vessel, the USS Washington Parke Custis. A Union balloon could be anchored to it and steered to where it was needed. The pilots were called aeronauts, but they were not commissioned as soldiers, and if captured, they would not be prisoners of war, but executed as enemy spies.
The Confederates hoped to do the same, and there are even references here and there to a Confederate dream of bombing Union cities from a great army of balloons, like those in those fictional stories about Napoleon. But the Confederacy was so short of the necessary materials that the only balloons we know they successfully completed were made out of dress silks.
Now, as to that story in the Newport News, it claims that Zeppelin, quote, received permission from Union officers to make the ascent, and while in the air he came under fire from Confederate troops, end quote. Then, needing to abandon the balloon, he had to, quote, slide down a restraining cable and burn the flesh from his hands during this emergency descent, an injury which prevented him from making another ascent, but somehow left him with a lifelong interest in balloons, end quote.
Now, this article offered no evidence to support this action movie scenario, and we do know they got one key fact wrong.
Von Zeppelin's visit to Virginia was in the summer of 1863, not 1862, and by then, the Union Army Balloon Corps had all but ceased operations. So, we may just have to chalk this up to local storytelling. Fake news, it seems, is not just a new concept.
The answer to this mystery, it happens, comes from von Zeppelin himself.
We do know he arrived in New York on May 6th of 1863 and stayed in Philadelphia for a few days and then continued to Washington, D.C. His military pass to observe Union forces was apparently arranged personally by President Lincoln after he met the young officer. Von Zeppelin joined up with the Army of the Potomac in a camp near Falmouth, Virginia. He spoke very little English, and his ornate European uniform clashed with the simpler dress of Union soldiers. As a non-combatant, von Zeppelin was barred from taking part in any fighting, but he did observe several engagements. And on June 20th, he joined a cavalry detachment carrying messages to General Pleasonton. He saw early skirmishes around Fredericksburg, but by the time of the Battle of Gettysburg in early July, he'd already returned to New York. There, he boarded a train and headed for the western frontier. Today, this is what we'd call Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Wisconsin, and Minnesota. He explored this rapidly developing territory for 2 months, several weeks of them in a canoe. Then, on August 17th of 1863, he checked into the opulent St. Paul International Hotel. And according to a letter to his father, it was here, not a Civil War battlefield, that von Zeppelin flew for the first time. Across the street from the hotel, a German-born traveling balloonist named John Steiner was offering rides $5 a passenger. That's about $105 today, so not a joyride that just anybody could afford. But on August 19th, von Zeppelin bought his ticket, and afterward he wrote to his father, quote, "Just now I ascended with Professor Steiner, the famous aeronaut, to an altitude of 600 or 700 feet," end quote. He went on to describe his excitement about the military potential of balloons, and in interviews later in life, von Zeppelin confirmed, "While I was above St. Paul, I had my first idea of aerial navigation strongly impressed upon me, and it was there that the first idea of my Zeppelins came to me," end quote.
It would take a long time for his vision to become a reality. Over 10 years later, entries from his diary show him developing designs for massive airships. He's attending lectures, watching the progress and inventions of others. A designer named Heinrich von Stefan presented a new innovation, a large, rigidly framed outer envelope containing a number of separate gas bags inside. But it wasn't until von Zeppelin's forced retirement from the military in the early 1890s, a full 30 years from his first balloon ride in St. Paul, that he could devote his time, passion, and considerable monetary resources to making powered airships that would eventually bear his name. Now, over those 30 years, Zeppelin had studied every development in the field, and he knew the necessary formula for success, including efficient fuel and lightweight materials. Yet he also recognized that he had to have the capacity to test and fail as often as it took to find a reliable design.
He took von Stefan's innovation of a rigid frame and made his semi-rigid, a lightweight aluminum skeleton combined with durable fabric. This would better protect the dangerous gas envelopes inside from wind and weather. And with 2 gasoline-fueled engines, a pitch elevator, a forward and aft rudder, von Zeppelin's design was a stunning leap forward in capability and sophistication. Part 3. The German military has a history of keeping things simple in naming equipment, and von Zeppelin had picked up this habit. His groundbreaking, game-changing dirigible, taking a year and a half to build, measuring a record-smashing 420 feet long and 38 feet in diameter, he simply named the Zeppelin LZ-1. And on July 2nd, 1900, almost 37 years after that balloon ride in Minnesota, the LZ-1 had its inaugural flight, carrying 5 passengers 4 miles in just 17 minutes. An emergency engine failure cut the journey short, but the flight could hardly be called a failure. It was the dawn of a new era, 150 years of imagination and labor by geniuses from many nations, all trying to create a controllable, powerful aircraft from the principles of a balloon, had produced the Zeppelin.
Von Zeppelin successfully flew LZ-1 2 more times until he had to halt and secure more funding.
Other inventors were pushing ahead on their own designs, but it was dangerous work. In 1902, a Brazilian inventor named Maranhão, along with his mechanic, died when their dirigible exploded over Paris. The pioneering silent filmmaker Georges Méliès recreated this disaster with special effects for a newsreel. But von Zeppelin would not be denied. He persuaded the King of Württemberg not just to hold a national lottery for funds, but to mortgage his own wife's estates as well. The Count put everything he had back into the work, and by April of 1905, he'd produced his follow-up. It was called, naturally, the LZ-2. Unfortunately, it managed only 1 flight before severe wind crippled it. But von Zeppelin was undaunted, and the LZ-3 had its first flight on October 9th of 1906. It broke all previous airship speed records by reaching 36 miles per hour. But von Zeppelin knew that speed alone wouldn't achieve the possibilities he'd dreamed of for his airships. The next challenge would be to give his Zeppelins the power to transport large numbers of people over great distances. and the LZ-3 needed to make room for the LZ-4. The LZ-4 was made up of 17 individual gas bags with a central crew cabin underneath. A ladder ran up the side to take you to an observation platform on top, so you could navigate by the stars. It also required a more effective steering mechanism than its predecessors, and the finned rudder on its stern became an iconic element of airship design for decades to come. The LZ-4 had its maiden voyage on June 20th, 1908. It was a short hop of 18 minutes, but it was just the precursor to voyages that would destroy any doubts about the range of the Zeppelin. On July 1st, the LZ-4 completed a staggering 12-hour flight, crossing over from Germany into Switzerland and returning again. The public and the German government were astounded, and von Zeppelin decided to push the boundaries even further. He announced that the LZ-4 would complete a full 24-hour flight. After a few false starts, the attempt began at 6:22 a.m. on August 4th. Crowds of people gathered along the flight path and looked to the skies to watch this astonishing invention floating through the heavens.
Now, before I tell you about the all-important outcome of the LZ-4's 24-hour flight, I want to take a moment and think about the people who were witnessing this event. They knew what they were seeing in the skies, and perhaps we could call those airships identified flying objects. You might recall earlier in this episode, I told you about the early UFO sighting reported by Alexander the Great over 2,000 years ago. But there's a fascinating and not entirely solved era of UFO sightings that coincide with the exact time period we're discussing, the era of the Zeppelin. But while the one would seem to explain the other, these sightings were taking place in areas that had no airship activity at all.
In November of 1896, a newspaper in Sacramento, California ran an article about a reported sighting of a lighted shape moving through the sky at about 1,000 feet of elevation. One witness swore he heard voices coming from the craft and saw the shapes of two men operating it from underneath with pedals. Just 2 days later, a newspaper in nearby Stockton told of a man's claim that he had spotted a strange metallic craft on the ground, and that 3 tall, slender beings who were, quote, emitting a strange warbling noise, end quote, attempted to force him aboard their ship. Sightings like these, sometimes referred to as the cigar-shaped craft, became a sensation in America, with thousands of sightings reported over the next 2 years. Speculation reached such a fevered pitch that even the inventor Thomas Edison felt pressured into publishing a declaration that he had no high-tech secret project roaming the skies. Now, as I said, this was from 1896 to 1897, but von Zeppelin didn't finish his first airship until 1900, and it was only flying in Europe. So what was it that people were seeing in the skies of America? Many of the sightings have been explained by natural phenomenon, but the fact that there was such an accelerating trend of sightings, just as both the airplane and the Zeppelin were becoming viable, seems like one of those uncanny moments where humanity's imagination was syncing up with scientific progress. While we won't answer this today, I have a fascinating case of a UFO sighting that I'll cover later in this season of My Dark Path. Now, back to the LZ-4 and its attempt to stay aloft for 24 hours. It turns out that it has a tragic end, but a tragedy that turned into a triumph. Engine difficulties forced the airship to land for repairs in the German city of Eckener, and there, for reasons we don't fully know, the airship's gas bags exploded into flames. The primary theory is that a gust of wind pulled it from its moorings, and a crew member tried to steer it back to the ground. And at that moment, some of the gas bags were torn on trees, with the rubberized fabric creating static discharge and igniting the hydrogen. The LZ-4 was gone and in front of the watching eyes of 2 nations, but rather than being the end of von Zeppelin's dream, it only elevated his work and the technology of the airship to new heights. German investors, businesses, and even individual families poured money into Zeppelin's company, more than $30 million by today's currency, and Germany collected on the investment it had made in him. The LZ-5 would be the first airship officially accepted into military service. Meanwhile, a professional airline, the German Airship Travel Corporation, started transporting passengers by Zeppelin in June of 1910. Before the outbreak of the First World War, some 37,000 passengers were carried on over 1,600 flights with a 100% safety record.
Soon, construction of Zeppelin-style semi-rigid airships was happening in France, Britain, Spain, Italy, America, and more. The idea was more popular than ever.
In 1908, legendary sci-fi author H.G. Wells wrote a book called The War in the Air, in which a mad German conqueror invades America by crossing the Atlantic with a fleet of airships. One of them even hovers over New York City, like a flying saucer did in the movie Independence Day. But back in the real world, an American explorer, Walter Wellman, was the first to attempt crossing the Atlantic Ocean. His airship, the America, departed Atlantic City on October 10th of 1910 and flew for 40 hours until an engine failure left it adrift in the skies. Wellman made history, but not in the way that he'd planned. He ended up placing the very first air-to-sea radio distress call and successfully evacuated the crew of the America to a British steamship.
But no one gave up on the idea of crossing the Atlantic in the air. It promised a revolution in travel. If you needed to cross an ocean, you could book passage on a ship, but ships were slow and the oceans were dangerous. The sinking of the Titanic in 1912 was enough to give one pause. But as the world went to war, ocean travel had even more potential to be deadly. And travelers were looking to the skies, but the war was already there. Thank you for watching this episode of My Dark Path. I'm MF Thomas, the creator and host. If you enjoyed this video, please hit the like button and then subscribe, and also hit the notification bell so you'll always know when we upload a new episode. And if you like My Dark Path, you can find dozens of our podcasts on any podcast network, or you can listen at www.mydarkpath.com. Again, thanks for walking the dark paths of history, science, and the paranormal with me. Until next time, good night. Hi, this is MF Thomas. Thank you for watching our first YouTube episode. To show our gratitude, we're doing a big giveaway to celebrate. We're giving away 75 copies of my third novel, Arcade, and 25 limited edition My Dark Path t-shirts. So to get your free book or t-shirt, just be one of the first 75 people to comment and subscribe. Also, we'll be launching our Explorers Society on Patreon in January 2021. Members of the Explorers Society will get exclusive episodes and other benefits. To learn more, click on the link in the description of this video to visit our Patreon. And again, thanks for supporting My Dark Path as we explore the fringes of history, science, and the paranormal.